I make sacrifices before I do the sermon, and so, we're talking about superheroes and heroes. So for you, I went to see the Avengers yesterday. I did that for you. It wasn't for me. It was just to help with this sermon. And wow, it was great. It was really a good movie. And so it's kind of a culmination of movies. I don't know if you know this whole thing that's been going on, but ever since you've saw the Hulk movies and the Iron Man movies and the Captain America movies, and all of this has been coming together to create this, Thor and all that. We also meet a couple new characters. Hawkeye is the one, and Black Widow is the woman in it. And so, they finally have all come together. Now, if you're, part of the Geek Squad like me, you stay all the way through the credits. And then at the end of the credits, there was this little extra scene. And the little extra scene had the Samuel Jackson character, Nick Fury, going around talking, trying to figure something out, bringing people together. You're wondering, what's happening here? And now the Avengers movie explains what all that was about. And I will have to say to you, if you go to see the Avengers, you're going to see a little sort of story after some of the credits, but stay all the way through. It's like another hour you got to wait to get all the credits. And then there's another scene at the end that is very funny. Okay, so you got to stay. Did anyone stay at the end like me? Am I the only one? A couple of you? Okay, it was great. So stay to the end. All right. So what is this whole universe about? Well, you got this thing, this villain that's so bad, right, that they have to get all of them, the Avengers, together. Just one superhero isn't enough. We got to bring, 6 in. And all of them became superheroes through a number of different ways. Some of it's through technology, this miraculous technology that, of course, would never work. But, they somehow have figured this out. Or maybe it was science that's gone awry and created your Hulk-like characters, right? Or, in a sense, Captain America. Or maybe it's mythology, and that's where you get Thor. Or maybe it's also just a little bit of a skill level that they have, Hawkeye and Black Widow with her ninja moves and all that kind of stuff. So that's what kind of makes them a superhero. And they all need to come together with their strengths in order to fight the bad guy. But I will say this to you. Elijah could kick all their butts. Oh, yeah. You know why? Because he's got the power of God on his side. Try to go up against that, bad guys. And that's why this story is so important. And this is what we really see in this. In the story of Elijah, we see some superhero kind of things happening here. In a way, he's kind of like Thor calling down, this fire and everything. But he can far exceed the power of any of them altogether. You don't need to have 6 of them to get together, because if you got one guy working with God, that's all you need. Now, let's look at the good guy of the story, because every story's got a good guy and a bad guy, right? The good guy is Elijah. Elijah's a prophet. His name means Yahweh is my God. And he was sent to the northern kingdom. So the last superhero we kind of looked at was David. David had his son Solomon. And then after Solomon, everything fell apart in Israel, and the nation went through a civil war, and it split. And so you had the northern nation, which had 10 tribes, and it was called Israel, and Samaria was its capital. And then you had the southern nation, which was Judah, and Jerusalem was its capital. And for the most part, the northern nation was evil. Pretty much all the kings were evil. They followed the evil practices of the gods of that time. And then the southern nation was pretty good, was better, let's say that. And they had Jerusalem, and they continued with a lot of the temple practices. Elijah was called to the bad area. And he did some amazing miracles during that time that just, maybe there's a couple of Jesus, obviously, Elisha and some others, Moses. He would be in that sort of who's who of miraculous prophets. He is so amazing and so good that he gets a chariot of fire to show up and to take him personally, escort him to heaven. Now, that's pretty good, right? I mean, the God to send a ship down, right, or whatever it was for him to get on and sort of take off. I mean, you're pretty close and tight with God if that's going to happen. The other thing is that he gets a curtain call, in the New Testament, when Jesus is up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and you know, he can choose anyone he wants to be at his side. He, of course, chooses Moses, but he's got Elijah there too. So this guy is pretty cool. We got to focus in on him. He is a good guy. Let's look at the bad guy. The bad guy is Ahab, King Ahab. And he reigned during 869 to 850 BC. His wife is Jezebel, and she was just as bad as he was. We know they're bad because nobody names their kid Ahab or Jezebel. Just like you don't get an Adolf or a Hitler, right? I mean, these names are off limits because we have associated them with badness. And he was a worthy villain, and Elijah's the one that's going to go up against him face to face. And here's what we're going to learn from Elijah. That in our lives, to be fearless, we need to be faithful. To be fearless, we need to be faithful. Let's give a little background on how this story starts. In 1 Kings 16, we first see Ahab coming into power, and what he does is immediately put together the Asherah poles, which is worshiping that god, and the altars to Baal in the capital of Samaria. So he's kind of saying, in our capital city, this is what's important to us. And God doesn't like it. And so in 17, he calls Elijah out of nowhere. And he says to Elijah, I want you to declare a famine, a drought on this area. And so that's how we first meet him, verse 1 of 1 Kings 18. After a long time, in the third year, this is 3 years of drought that occurred, now the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. So he declares the famine. 3 years later, it's time for the famine, the drought, to be lifted. And so now he's got to go face to face with Ahab. Now this is scary. Why is this scary? Ahab's not happy. He's not happy that this prophet was the one that had declared the drought to occur. But Elijah goes anyway. Why? Well, we're going to look at an acrostic here and fill in some of these letters. The first one is that he was fearless. The F in faith is fearless. And he was fearless because he knew who was in charge. How did he know who was in charge? Well, the word of the Lord came to him. That's the key right there. If the word of the Lord can come to you, then you know that he's real, that he's alive, that he knows what's happening, and what he says happens. So he's the one who would be in charge. He knew the word of the Lord. How did he know the word of the Lord? Well, back then it was very limited, the ways that you would know the word of the Lord. Right? It would just be through prayer. The word of the Lord would come to you. It's not like they had Bibles that were being distributed everywhere. Today, we have an advantage. We have many ways to hear the word of the Lord. We not only have prayer like an Elijah did, but we have church. We come to church to hear the word of the Lord. We go to our small groups in order to hear the word of the Lord. We have the Bible, which is actually called the word of the Lord. And so we constantly have that ability to know that God is in charge as we continue to read about him and know him and understand his power. Now, this is scary for Elijah to go up against Ahab. Why? Ahab thinks he's in charge. And when someone thinks they're in charge, they're very dangerous. Elijah knows he's not in charge, and that ultimately Elijah's own fate does not rest in Ahab, that it rests in God. And the question here is coming up is, who is really in charge here? Elijah knows. Ahab's going to find out. Now the famine, it goes on in verse 2, was very severe in Samaria. And Ahab had summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of his palace. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. And while Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. This is the Obadiah in the minor prophet books that few of us ever read. But this guy's a star too, a celebrity. He's got his own book out of the 66. And this guy is walking around right now because Ahab had said to him, go find some grass for my animals. What a great job being a prophet, going around looking for grass for the animals. But he had asked him to go do that. And he meets up with Elijah face to face. First of all, this tells Elijah that he's not alone. And it also alerts him to know that Elijah is a wanted man. And Obadiah has been told to bring Elijah to Ahab. It's got to be scary knowing that you're a wanted man. Elijah is not afraid. Neither is Obadiah. In verse 12 it says, I don't know where the Spirit, this is Obadiah talking, I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here? He's going to kill me. Elijah said, as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. Ahab has him on the wanted list. Jezebel is killing the prophets at that time. But you know what? Even though Obadiah knows that he's a dead man, he says these words, I'm a servant. I'm still following. I might be a dead man, but I'm still following. I know who's in charge. He says, I've been following the Lord since my youth. Why would I give up on him now? Why? Because there's this little scary situation. Would I turn and hide? He continued to minister where he was called, in the palace, even though the threat of death was there. And he went and went up against the opposition by hiding the prophets so they would not die. This guy has guts. So does Elijah. And Elijah says, I'm going too. I'm going to present myself to Ahab. I don't care if I die. Ahab is not in charge. And both Elijah and Obadiah fill in the second part of the faith acrostic. The A stands for active. And if you're going to be fearless, you've got to be active. You've got to face your fears. You have to face your fears. Now, every time I hear this expression about fear, I always think of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, right? And I've always heard it as, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And I've always thought of that line, and I went, how can you, if you're fearing fear, then aren't you experiencing fear? And how can you be fearless if you're fearing something and that fear is fear, right? It's like a Dr. Seuss book or something, but that's what's always going through my head. That didn't make sense. Well, I read the quote in context, and here's what he said. This is his inaugural address, the first one, March 4th, 1933. He says, this is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. We need to hear this speech today, right? So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he goes on, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Wow, that's really good. This is what he's saying. The only time we need to be afraid is when we're going up against something that we don't even know what it is. Right? It's unreasonable. It's unjustified. We can't even name it. And what Elijah and what Obadiah are doing is, I know the fear. It's not an unreasonable fear. It's a real fear. I know the fear, but I'm still going up against it. And so this is what he is telling him to do. Face your fears. Do something about it. Obadiah was hiding prophets. Elijah's going up against the king. And we have to say to ourselves, we have to face them also. I mean, we live in a world that thrives on fear. I mean, Fox News wouldn't be in business if it wasn't for fear. I mean, every time you turn it on, it's always breaking news, or this just in, or this sort of thing. You're always like, oh no, what happened, right? And then it's like, Congress just departed for lunch. And you're like, is that it? Why are you doing this to me? And our whole weird, I mean, read the front, you read these headlines, you're like, oh no. And then you read the story and you're like, oh, that's nothing. This world is about fear, but we have to face them. I have faced my fears, Skydiving was scary. Then I did it. Not scared of it anymore. In the midst of it, looked out and going, this is stupid. Did it. Not afraid. I've spoken in public. Well, I'm speaking in public right now. I'm not afraid. But I remember the first time, I just didn't understand why knees would shake. It doesn't make sense. Why are you shaking? And, that's what was happening at the time. I was trying to hide behind the podium going, I hope nobody sees this. Faced it, done it, overcome it. I used to be afraid of weddings and funerals. In fact, for the longest time, I felt God was saying, you need to be ordained, you need to become a pastor. And I went, I don't want to do weddings and funerals, Lord. Right? I mean, you can do 52 sermons and blow one and be okay, you got another one. But these are once-in-a-lifetime kind of things, right? These are things that brides don't forget, So I didn't want to do it. You know what? I went ahead, I did it, faced it, overcome it. I've preached to Muslims in a Muslim country while they were all around, some of them holding knives in their hand. I can do it. I can do it now. I've overcome it. Face cancer in our own lives. My wife having breast cancer, we went through it. I even had the fear of what would it be like to have a bald wife. And you know what? She's beautiful, so it worked out. I faced it. I faced the fear of being in a car with a teenage son driving. We're still working on that one. And boy, you're not in control at times like that, right? But, you got to go up against them. And some of us, if we could just say, if I can die and face all of my fears, I've had a successful life. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Every time you have a fear, you're fearing the repercussion. You're fearing the punishment, which ultimately is death. And if you're a Christian, why are you afraid of death, right? Where is the victory in death? Where is the sting in death? The worst that can happen to you is you can leave this earth and go be with God forever. Why be afraid? So Elijah goes and meets up with Ahab. Ahab has encouraging words for him. The first thing he says to him is, you're a troublemaker, Elijah. Confrontational right away. Elijah comes right back. Well, I haven't made trouble for Israel. Elijah replied, you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel to assemble the prophets of Mount Carmel, and Elijah went before the people and he said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. The people said nothing. What is he doing here? This is the I in faith. It's intentional. It's intentional. It's intent. It's about your intent. And Elijah is saying is you have to make up your mind. Who are you going to follow? Even his whole name says who he believes. Yahweh is my God. What happens in fear is there's indecision. We don't know who to follow. We haven't made up our minds. And at times right now that we're facing, we're saying, is my boss in charge or is God in charge? Is the economy in charge or is God in charge? Is cancer in charge or is God in charge? Is the demonic world in charge or is God in charge? Notice what Elijah does here. He asked them to make up their mind before they saw the miracle that would occur. That's where faith is. Faith is saying, I believe without seeing. They'll later believe when they see, but he's saying, why don't you make up your minds not right now? Their answer is, They don't want to make the decision. And you have to make up your mind. If you don't make up your mind to who you're going to follow and who's in charge, then you are going to be overcome with fear. And then in verse 22, Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450. So this is 1 against 450. Get 2 bulls for us and let them choose for themselves and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood and not set fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood but not set fire to it. And then you call in the name of your God, and I will call in the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. Right? It's a showdown. Whoever God can set the bull on fire wins. Then all the people said, hey, what you say is good. Right? Got everybody there. This is a pay-per-view event, right? Everybody's coming out to see what's going to happen here. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. So he's giving them the option, right? Just so they couldn't say, well, you had a more combustible bull than we did, so that's not fair. He's saying, you decide, whatever one you want. I'll go second. And he says, you decide because there's so many of you. I'm outnumbered. You have the majority. And he says, call in the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal. From morning till noon. Oh, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But shockingly, there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar they had made. Now, these people sincerely believed, okay? But what they sincerely believed was sincerely wrong. But they kept it up, probably out of embarrassment. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. This is why you got to kind of like Elijah. He's a smart aleck. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is God. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and has to be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. He's pretty insensitive, isn't he? I mean, today he'd get fired by making comments like this that were so religiously intolerant, you know. But he was absolutely right, and they just tried harder, and nothing happened. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. No response, no one answered, no one paid attention. So he's saying to them, hey, people, take a look at this, right? He's like, show all the people are there. Will you look at this? This is what you want to believe? This frantic, cutting, chanting, it's embarrassing, he's going. Well, who is this God Baal? You know, who was it? What was it about him that made him sort of attractive? Let me give you a little insight into this other God that we're talking about here. Baal is really in the Bible a reference to any false god, but specifically it was a god of rain, a god of fertility, the god of thunder, and the god of agriculture. And the Canaanites, and this is that area, that region is called the Canaanites, believed him to be a god of rain and storm, and he was often pictured with thunderbolts in his hand and riding on the back of a bull. So this gives him that power. Being on a bull has strength, so that gives him strength too. So that's how he is pictured. And the story goes that he was in a conflict with the god Sea, S-E-A, and Baal then became the king of the gods. And then Mot, who's the god of death and of the dry season, you don't have to write this down because it's not true, was his rival and killed him and took him down to his domain in the underworld. And so Baal's sister, Anat, A-N-A-T, began to slash herself so the blood would flow in order to rise him up out of the ground. This explains the context of all the things that were going on in the story. Elijah asked for bulls to be there because their god was commonly associated with bulls. Gee, that seems to give that god an advantage, doesn't it? It then says, well, if he's going to control thunder, certainly he can light a fire, right? And since he's the god of rain, he can make it rain here. And this explains why they were dancing around and cutting themselves, because they thought that if their blood flowed, they could rise their god out of the grave or out of his sleeping. None of it would work. You have to understand how bad these villains were. at this time, these other gods. Howard Voss, in a book that was written in 1953, said, one may question that those ancient enemies of Israel were as evil as the Bible claims they were, but even a superficial glance at Canaanite religion alone ably demonstrates their iniquity. Base sex worship was prevalent, and religious prostitution even commanded. Human sacrifice was common, and it was a frequent practice in an effort to placate their gods, to kill young children and bury them in the foundations of a house or public building at the time of construction. These are some bad guys. This is why God was upset. And Elijah is saying, this is what you want to believe? Do you see what they're really all about? Make up your minds, people. Well, even though the odds were stacked against him, Elijah still wasn't scared. He still wasn't worried. Look at what he says next, verse 30. Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. And they came here to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. He took the 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. He's really building the foundation before them on the word of the Lord, the God of the past. And he says, with the stones he had built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. That's about 13 quarts of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, laid it on the wood. Then he said, fill 4 large jars of water and pour it on the offering on the wood. Now, I'm no Boy Scout, okay? But I would think you don't pour water on your wood before you light it. But he's stacking the odds against his God. And he's saying, do it again. They did it again. He says, do it a 3rd time. He ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. And the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. And at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Why did he stack the odds again? Why did he make this so impossible that there is no way that a fire could light? Because, and this is the T in faith, he trusted. He had trust. And in order to have trust, you need a relationship to have trust. You only trust those that you know them. You know their hearts. You know their power. You know what it is that they want. Those are the people that you trust. He trusted in the Lord. It took a lot of trust during a drought to pour all of this good water onto the fire. They could have gone without more water now because of this. But Elijah's saying, I trust, I know, it's okay. God is in charge. He knew that God would overcome the elements. And most of all, what he wanted to do here was not just to put on a spectacular display, but he wanted to turn the hearts of the people to God. And that is why, one of the reasons we see this story here, because he wants us to turn our hearts back to him, to trust him, to know that he's in charge, and to turn our burdens over to him. Well, in verse 38 it says, the fire of the Lord fell, burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. It also licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah and them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Elijah trusted God. God came through. Who's afraid now? And the story is saying if you don't have that relationship with him, eventually your life goes into the valley and you die apart from God. And that's the reality of this situation here, that you're going to have to trust and have that relationship with God if you are going to live eternally in that relationship forever. And then God came through. The fire of the Lord fell, burned it all up, right? Everybody is screaming and going, yes, he is the God. They finally understood through this. The enemies have been defeated. God has been triumphant. They now know who is in charge. And Elijah prays here in verse 44. And he tells the servant to look for the rain. And it says here, the seventh time the servant responded. I think that's important because that has to do with trust also. Because a lot of times, well, I prayed once, God, where are you? I prayed twice, God, where are you? If you trust, you keep praying. And it may be 7 times. It may be 7 interviews you have to go through until you get that job. It may be 7 trips to the doctor you have to go to until you get the positive result. It may be 7 classes you have to take. Whatever it may be, it may take 7, 17, 77, 700, I don't know. But if you trust, you're not the kind saying, well, I want this kind of Elijah response right now. It doesn't always happen. In fact, he turned around and prayed. It's not like the rain fell. He had to wait too, and he had to trust. And it says here, the servant reported, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. So Elijah said, go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, and a heavy rain came on Ahab. And Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The final letter here, the acrostic, the H, is hope. Hope sees beyond the problem. You see, the answer was this little tiny cloud way off in the distance. It was really small. And Elijah had the opportunity to sit there and look at the famine and go, wow, this looks bad right here, right? I see the problem right here. Or he could look to the sky beyond the problem to look for the answer. And that's where fear occurs. If we stare at our situation, if we stare at the state of our world and our economy and our marriage, if we just sit there and stare at it, it looks bad and we get scared. But what he's saying is, don't look there. Look out to the sky. Look up for hope. Look up to God. Look out beyond it. And there you will find the hope. And the hope is what's going to sustain you and get you beyond the fear. So fear stares at the problem. And when it does, it just knows your own limitations. It just reminds you all the time as you look at the problem how limited you are. Fearlessness looks beyond the problem, and it looks up to God. Fear believes that there are other forces that are in charge. Fearlessness says, no, God is in charge. Fear sees nothing but death and famine. Fearlessness sees life. We have to have that relationship. We have to know that heart of God. If you depart from any of those ways, if you go and go try to seek help elsewhere besides with God, you're going to think something else is in charge. And then they're going to let you down. And then when you do, you go, oh no, what are we going to do? And all along, God's saying there, take a look at me. Come to me. Let me speak to you. Let me give you the hope that you need. Trust in me and that relationship with me. It's got to be intentional, and we got to face the fears. This is a great story of a superhero with this sort of superpower that we see, and he goes up against the bad guys, and he wins. But what about us? Many of us are up against our own sort of villains and things that we're facing in our lives. It could be any number of things that we see, medical reports. It could be business problems that we're having, relationships within our families. All kinds of things are going on right now. And we got to ask ourselves right now, who is in charge?